Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Between Two Fires by Chistopher Buehlman, which I was very different from what I was expecting with, but I just recently finished this, and I did audio. It was narrated by Stephen West, who I thought did a really good job. It seemed to fit the type of story really well as there's a lot of French words, which he pronounces very French, so that also worked as well. But this I decided to read as my horror book for October, because I don't usually read a lot of horror, and I really liked Black Tongue Thief, so I was interested to try more Buehlman, and I know he was billed as kind of being a horror author when that was coming out. I remember talking about that. This though was, I didn't really know much about this, and I like to go into books blind, I did here, and so it was not at all what I was thinking. So this one takes place in the 1300s, in the midst of plague, and it follows, we see just kind of the horrific experiences and everything that are a part of that and the real history. And so it has that kind of historical fiction feel, but it then institutes more of the kind of horror or fantasy type elements. It's kind of a really hard book to really define as a genre, because it puts more of that in. But the structure too follows a almost biblical kind of view, because of the specific setup with the beginning of this book explaining basically that the plague, as well as a lot of other disasters at the time, were the direct work of demons and fallen angels who were trying to make the people of Earth and humanity suffer as God was away and not answering, basically. And so that's kind of the setup. And so it's going through a very real historical time period that has a lot of just horrific elements all on its own, with the plague and the reality of the horrors of that, while then slowly building into the more supernatural elements of it, while we see this kind of good versus evil going on. But it doesn't at all follow a normal good versus evil type of setup, because of the fact that it's pretty much everybody is in a situation where there's not a lot of faith in anything. Nobody's just living and sitting pretty and doing everything. It's so many people are dead from the plague. There's not enough food to go around, and it's just these conditions are absolutely terrible, and it's forced people to go into a completely different lifestyle if they've even survived. And that's kind of what we see for our main character, Tomas, who was formerly a knight and had kind of fallen in with some brigands, and is going through his arc where he's done some terrible things, and he has a lot of anger and rage about things in his past, but is also trying to do the right thing in other ways. And then we also follow a young girl who is able to speak with angels and is somehow important to some sort of way to help things along. I'm trying to be vague so as not to have spoilers yet. I'll talk some spoilers later though. And then we also have a priest whose name is harder to pronounce, so I'm not going to try, who is not the best priest, and also going through his own struggles with morality and faith and other things. And so it's a very gritty look at the events of this time period, which I feel you can't really do and not have it be dark and gritty, because that's just the reality of it. And like I said, then weaves in these horror elements. There are some definite scenes that feel very much out of something from horror, and there are some definite scenes that feel something very much out of fantasy as well. And it's just woven together into this story that still feels, in a lot of ways, almost like historical fiction with these other elements. So really kind of a genre-bending type of story. It's really hard to fit in exactly where this sits, and I think that's okay, because no matter what you want to call it, it was really, really good and compelling. This is very dark, and so do want to be clear on that as well. Very, very dark, and it's, once again, I feel that's, when you're given the time period you're talking about, I feel that is going to be likely, because some of the depictions just of the plague and the death and just the normal things, before we even get to the extraordinary elements of the story, before we get to any of that, it's pretty horrific. and it's just the way that it's set up. We've got a lot of there's violence and there's a lot of other things going on here, so be aware of that. But it's just done in such an interesting and compelling way as we go through this story and we follow this journey, and it will keep you from really knowing what's going on, because we're in a situation where even the characters, they, you know, the girl feels that she has something she needs to do, and even she's not really sure what it is. Tomas feels compelled to follow with her, even though he's not entirely sure why. And the priest, who kind of ends up tagging along as well, falling in, and they're on this trip. And the characters themselves are developed extremely well, especially Tomas, the way he is written. It's he's very complex, and he will use, like, you know, humor and sarcasm a lot to just try to not take things seriously and not look at things because he's so cynical from things that have happened in his past. But also, you know, you see through how he's written that there is more to him than that as well. And it's not always things that are blatantly stated, but just kind of as you see his story. The priest also being pretty complex. And then our young girl, who I haven't named her because that's not revealed for quite a bit into the story, and so I'm going with it to be as vague as possible at this point, as well, and seeing her as she's kind of growing up in these terrible times and how that it has affected her. And so really, really compelling story, just interesting with the way that things are blended together. There's definitely some things you may recognize from some elements from, but the way that the story is told is just done in a really interesting and creative way, really, to blend all of these different elements to a story. It's made me even more curious to try anything else that Christopher Buehlman has written, because Black Tongue Thief I really enjoyed for a lot of reasons. This, though, I enjoyed this much more, and you'd think it'd be the opposite. You'd think I'd like the fantasy one more versus the kind of historical fiction horror with some fantasy mixed in. A lot less of my genre, but just a phenomenal book in here. And so I definitely enjoyed it. Now I'm going to talk about some spoilers, because there's some things I just absolutely have to specifically mention in here, specifically relating to some big things at the end, and so I'll put a tag. You can skip past the spoiler section if you've not read the book, because I'm going to be ruining some big things if you have. So skip past if you haven't, but we're going to start that now. So the journey that Tomas and Delphine and the friar they're going on is pretty dark. With the creatures and the way that they're described, I thought was very interesting, starting with like the serpent type creature, but seeing these, we've got monsters and demons and fallen angels and the living dead and all kinds of other things with it. It was done really well, and there were a couple of the scenes that felt a little familiar, as like going to the castle where it's secretly it's all these like demons, or they're dead, and they're trying to keep them there. That reminded me of some things that I've seen, some fantasy elements, but then there were just other parts where it was pretty completely different, and so those parts. But getting in, I kept thinking that it was going to be something, because it wasn't made super clear, and in parts it becomes more obvious what's going to happen, but with Delphine and her being like called to do something, I was thinking it was going to end up her being like, I don't know why, but I kept expecting it, like she was gonna like basically give a virgin birth to an angel or something that was going to save the day, and instead with it ending up being basically like Jesus returning through her, which is not outright stated but made pretty evident by the end, and then be able to come out and be like reborn as an angel through her after she is stabbed with the spear that was originally used to stab Jesus' side when he was crucified. Really was not expecting that to go down quite that way at all. And then the fact that we have Tomas literally die and go to hell. That was when that happened, and I'm like, is it going to end like this? I'm like, are we going to literally end with they're both dead and he's in hell? And I kind of expected it with the tone of the story so far. Instead, we get the much happier ending, which I actually thought was very, very fitting for the story, because it doesn't feel cheap, or like it's like, oh, and they lived happily ever after. It feels more earned, especially with what Tomas goes through and his choice to remember Delphine, and even with the explanation that, you know, it's going to be harder for you to remember her. He chooses to anyway. The meeting with her, where she's still in the village where she started, doesn't have any memory of him or any of the things that had happened, but he is going to basically take care of her and adopt her as his daughter. And down to even the epilogue with him meeting again his wife from many years ago at that point, because that seems to take place much later, and kind of making peace within himself. I wasn't expecting the kind of happy ending, the kind of redemption that he goes through, but it felt very fitting. And that was kind of his Tomas the whole time. Is he had a lot of rage. He felt he'd been betrayed. He'd gone through a lot, and he wanted to be a knight again. He wanted to have honor, and he wanted to do these things, but he struggled, and especially in such a brutal world with everything happening, where it's said so many times throughout, it feels like it's the end days and the world is ending and this is the apocalypse, because that's how bad things are. It's kind of the worst time probably to try and go through a redemption in your life, and he manages to still get to it. And so really fitting ending. I was not expecting it to go that way, both the negative and the positive things that happened to it, but I still just, when I got to the part where he's literally in hell, I'm just like, what? Is this really what we're doing? And so it really just kind of blew me away with that. I was not expecting to get those scenes at all. But once again, made it very compelling, and I feel like having the character literally go through hell before that they're taken out and saved makes it feel more earned, because it's not like you helped, you're fine now. It's like, no, you literally went to hell for a while before you were saved. And so it was very unexpected in a lot of ways, and the way everything came together I thought was just extremely satisfying with this book. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. It was, like I said, very compelling, very dark subject matter in a lot of different ways, but just told in such an interesting way that just makes you want to keep going and find out with these characters. This also very much feels like something that is screaming to be adapted, because the way the scenes are described, and especially with the audio too, it's just so very easy to picture everything, and I just hearing the scenes and going through, and I just one of those books where I could just see everything happening. I could see it done. I could see how it could be done really well, and so I don't know if that'll happen, but I think this would be really cool and disturbing at the same time to see adapted for like a movie. Probably wouldn't need a TV show, because you can tell the story, I feel like, fairly quickly, but just one of those things where which has happened, interestingly enough, because Nightmare Land, which granted entirely different but also horror, was another thing where I was just reading and like I could see it all in my head so clearly, like I was watching it almost as I was reading that. So I don't know, maybe I do need to try some more horror, but really enjoyed this just immensely. This was definitely a 5-star for me, and took me by surprise, but in a really good way. And it's another reason I like to go in blind, because coming in not at all knowing what to expect, it was just, it made it so that I really didn't know what I was getting into, and I was just having a good time, as good a time as you can have with the story, which is pretty morbid at points, but really good read. Definitely recommend. If you like historical fiction, horror, fantasy, any of that kind of thing, because it has some of that appeal, I definitely think this is one that you should check out. So those are really my thoughts on Between Two Fires by Chistopher Buehlman. Definitely let me know if you've read this, your thoughts in the comments down below. Very interested to hear other people's thoughts on this one, and if you have read other Buehlman, what I should check out next by this author, because I definitely will want to check out more. So definitely let me know in the comments. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the link in the description, as always, for the Wizardly Duo Discord if you want to chat books, whether this book, other books, any books, really anything at all. It is a lot of fun, and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.